What better person to drive us into this uncharted territory than a young mayor who surprised us by transforming a city in the heartland of America in a single decade. Rhodes Scholar, Harvard McKinsey trained, Navy lieutenant, 2020 candidate for president, youngest ever, history-making, boy wonder, Secretary of Transportation. Please help me welcome our Honorable Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg.
Well, thank you, Megan, for the kind introduction and for your friendship. It is great to be reunited with you, and I am delighted to be referred to as a boy wonder because, strangely, I've noticed every day I seem to be older than I was the previous day, and the pattern has not reversed itself yet. It's a real treat to be with you, to be with Secretary Slater, who has been such a great source of insight. And somebody whose example I often look to in pursuing our work. Ambassador, thank you for hosting us. Thank you to everyone at Meridian, including Fred Hochberg, who encouraged me to come, and I'm sorry that he can't be here today, but I know he would if he could. I'll be exceedingly brief in introductory remarks because I'd like for us to make the most of the conversation that we're about to have, but I thought I would mention a few things to help illustrate the relevance of international relations and relationships to the work that we're doing at the Department of Transportation. And I would start by noting that while, of course, we are a largely domestically oriented agency, it also seems that so many of the challenges that we address that define our work are not challenges that are confined by national borders. Whether we're dealing with supply chains, climate change, health, or safety, all of these are manifestly interconnected and so often require international expertise and cooperation to confront them. I will, though, start by offering a little bit about the domestic context in terms of that bipartisan infrastructure law that we are now fast at work implementing. If you think of the administration's tenure here as a sort of a four-year arc in this term, year one was really focused on getting that legislation passed. And then it took much of the next year to establish the programs that would make it possible to deploy the $1.2 trillion made possible by that law, about half of which is for transportation. Which means that the years to follow, years 3 and 4, the season that we're in right now, is the dynamic season we've all been waiting for, where the projects began to take shape. If year 1 was about the bill passing and year 2 was about the programs launching, years 3 and 4 are about the money moving and then the dirt flying. And that is very much happening around us. Just to illustrate that, I'll share a little bit about my week. Tuesday morning, I was on the I-5 bridge in Vancouver, Washington, that links Washington and Oregon across the Columbia River. It is what I would call one of the cathedrals of our infrastructure, a massive structure that is 107 years old and very much in need of replacement. But it's not been possible to assemble the funding to do that until now. Because the President's infrastructure plan made it possible for us to bring a $600 million grant to go toward the reconstruction that they need to undertake. But what I really want to convey is the range of activity that's going on, because the same programs known as MEGA and Infra that are contributing to that grant are also helping us add truck parking in sites around the country, Tennessee, Wyoming, that are probably not regarded as among the iconic structures of U.S. transportation, but critically important to our supply chains because truck drivers are not finding enough places to park, which presents an issue that touches safety as well as the fluidity of our goods movement. Yesterday, I was in Charlotte, where we announced $27 million in funding to contribute toward renovations and upgrades that they're doing at one of the major growing hubs on the East Coast, one of the biggest hubs in the United States aviation system. But that same program, the airport terminal program, is also funding an investment at an airport in North Dakota, Standing Rock Airport in Fort Yates, where I can't even say that we're renovating their terminal because they don't have a terminal. we're funding them to get a terminal, to have an actual building, which, even though there aren't large airliners going in and out of that airport, is incredibly important because one of the missions served by their general aviation airstrip is air ambulance flights that go to the nearest hospital. And the pilots and patients will finally have access to a building that can be erected with a 6-figure grant. So whether we were talking about multi-billion-dollar projects like the Hudson River Tunnel that represents one of the largest public works infrastructure projects in the United States in our time, or whether we're talking about a 6-figure grant that's going to transform a streetscape in a town that has been plagued with too many traffic deaths, all of it adds up into this season of infrastructure where we have 40,000 projects and counting, making transportation better. And we're putting hundreds of thousands of people to work in the process, which is, of course, one of the reasons why we were so energetic about this legislation in the first place. It's why it's called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, with emphasis on the jobs. But as I said, all of this is connected to the work that we're doing around the world and what we can learn from our partners around the world. Supply chains is a term that I think was not a household term 3 or 4 years ago. Now it very much is kitchen table talk, especially after the congestion, blockage, and disruptions that we saw in 2021 as a consequence of COVID. And international cooperation is very important there. We've worked with ASEAN to find ways to move cargo shipping more smoothly, and we're working with a range of countries to keep mariners safe and keep supply chains running in light of what is taking place right now with threats in the Red Sea. Meanwhile, on the aviation side, we've been working with the International Civil Aviation Organization and the aviation industry directly to standardize public health measures during COVID, to strengthen security measures in response to Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, to reduce global emissions through the use of sustainable aviation fuels, and so many more efforts that can only be done in cooperation with our partners. Which brings me to the third point I want to mention, which is the many areas in which, in all humility, we recognize that the United States can learn a great deal and improve a great deal through international engagement and partnership. And I'll mention 2 areas in particular. One, project delivery. If we can figure out a way to be 1% more efficient on a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, that represents $10 billion of value that will have been unlocked. Or to put it in the negative, every 1% that is spent less efficiently than it could be because of things taking too long or costing too much is $10 billion worth of value that we won't get unless we get this right. And we know that there are many countries around the world, including countries whose commitment to labor and environmental protections are certainly no less robust than our own, who have found ways to deliver infrastructure more quickly and efficiently. And we want to make sure that we are learning from that. The other thing I would note is the crisis of deaths on our roadways. We are just starting to see the numbers begin to go down just a little bit. But that's only after reaching a high of about 40,000. That is on par with the level of death associated with gun violence in the United States. Or to put it in a different perspective, at a time when we are rightly moving heaven and earth to address aviation safety because of a quality issue that led to a plug door being blown out on a 737 MAX 9. I would note that a number of people that is equivalent to a full 737 is lost on a daily basis on our roadways. We have seen how other countries have been able to make remarkable progress in confronting roadway deaths. And it's a particularly important moment to do that because of the technologies that are emerging. We need to find ways to make the most of the safety potential of automation that is on the horizon while addressing the safety concerns that are associated with this technology today. And this is not a problem or a set of solutions that will be confined to any one state. So having offered just a few examples there, I'll end with this. This is a moment when the U.S. is very focused on taking care of the basics, making sure that the basics of everyday life are not a concern so that people can spend their energy on more purposeful questions than whether there's going to be a glass of clean, safe drinking water coming out of the tap, or whether the internet is available and affordable, or whether there's a hole in the road confronting you on your way to work. But we do that not only because that's what government is for, but also in the recognition that that is inseparable from our commitment to democracy, because we believe the legitimacy of our approach to government as a society is bound up with our ability to deliver in those concrete aspects. And that's part of why I'm so excited about the investments that we're making, but also mindful about how much depends on our effectively delivering them here in the U.S. and in dialogue with our international partners. So with that, I will show myself to my seat, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. First of all, Mr. Secretary, go Navy.
Amen. Unless they're playing Notre Dame.
I had to get that in. Before we get started, this is such a great country where people can build an amazing future, an optimistic future. And since we have so many international distinguished guests, I thought it would be interesting to note that your father came to the United States from Malta.
Yeah.
Is that, now I'm sure when he came, he didn't expect perhaps that his son would be a cabinet secretary. But I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about that and what that means to you and your family.
Yeah, my father was born, I can't even say a Maltese citizen, he was born a British subject because Malta only gained its independence later on. And immigrated in the 1970s, as so many people did, for educational opportunity, which brought him to the U.S., and then he became a citizen and settled in, eventually in South Bend, Indiana, which is where I grew up and became mayor. And I do wonder sometimes what the level of culture shock might have been for somebody from Malta, especially settling in Indiana. This may be apocryphal, but it's said that the Inuit people have about 50 different words for snow because they have so much experience with it, and all very subtle differences call for different vocabulary. Maltese does not have a word for snow. They use the word silge, which means ice. So when I overhear my father talking to his family on the phone in Malta, as he would often around Christmas, he would say, "Hafna silge." There's a lot of ice out there, meaning it was snowing. Yeah. But like so many who come to America, he found a great life here. Yeah. And I've always held the good fortune of having the international exposure that came with being my father's son in mind as I've done my work since.
I think it's a great story, and it's a great reminder with all the negativity and the news that we're bombarded with, that these kinds of stories happen in America, and they're just amazing. And obviously, you in your career, through your work and your vision, took that to another level. So I wanted to ask you, before we get into sort of the macro issues, the president today is traveling to East Palestine, Ohio, to show support for the community there 1 year after the train derailment. Your agency obviously has some meaningful work going on to deal with train safety and these kinds of issues. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what the president's hoping to do and what you're working on as it relates to that.
Yeah, the president is there because the mayor of East Palestine invited him to visit, and I think it's especially important right now because it's a chance to demonstrate that our administration's commitment to the people of East Palestine didn't end when all of the cameras and the media and political firestorm around that place ended a few weeks after the derailment, that we're in it for as long as it takes. And I think this will also be a chance just to show support for a great community. When I speak to people who I got to know when I visited about a year ago, who I've kept in touch with, I really hear two things. One, the community doesn't want to be defined by this. But two, they don't want to be forgotten, and they expect and deserve support for as long as it takes. And I think the president's visit goes to show that. In terms of what we've done since, our agency was on the ground within the first few hours, but the main part that the Department of Transportation has had is in responding to what happened by applying lessons with regard to railroad safety. And that led to inspections, focused inspections of thousands of miles of track, It led to new regulations, including one that we recently issued that has to do with emergency escape breathing apparatus for personnel who are on trains. It led to a lot of pressure from us on the Class 1 railroad companies, which they have been partially responsive to improve their practices. And what it has not led to, but should, is a bipartisan Railway Safety Act. It has been filed. It was proposed in just within weeks of that disaster. It is still waiting its turn in Congress. And again, it's bipartisan. There were Republican and Democratic co-sponsors, and yet it's just sitting there.
What's holding it up?
Turn. Great question.
Could ask that about anything today, right?
I mean, look, the railroad industry is certainly resisting this legislation. What's more frustrating to me is that members of Congress are resisting this legislation who had a lot to say in the immediate aftermath of the crash, but are nowhere to be found when it comes time to get them on the record about the Bipartisan Railway Safety Act. I think now would be a good time. Yesterday would have been a good time, but now would be a very good time for these members to get it together, because again, it's bipartisan, and it would include a number of measures that would strengthen the hand of my department when it comes to ensuring rail safety, not just to do right by the people of East Palestine, but all the communities out there wondering if they could be next.
So I was doing a little bit of history research, and I was sort of looking at the creation of this Department of Transportation. And it was interesting. I'm not sure if this is entirely accurate, but Najib Halaby, who at the time was chairman of Pan Am and was the father of Queen Noor of Jordan, who was also a friend of President Johnson's, told the president, he said, look, who's in charge of transportation in the federal government? And Johnson said, well, I don't know. We need to get something done about that. And so in 1967, they created a Department of Transportation, right? But it also is a collection of agencies too. I mean, you have everything from the FAA, the Merchant Marine. I mean, so much. Highway Administration. Could you give the audience just a snapshot of some of the principal agencies or functions of the Department of Transportation?
Yeah, first I'll break it down administratively, and then I'll try again functionally, which might be more intelligible. But the department includes many agencies that did exist in the days of President Johnson, but hadn't been brought under one roof. The Federal Highway Administration, which Secretary Slater led before becoming secretary. The Federal Aviation Administration, which is larger than the rest of the Department of Transportation combined. In fact, the largest DOT flag I've ever seen is the one that flies out front of FAA headquarters. Parts that you would think about and know about a lot: rail, transit. Parts that don't get as much attention, like the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, or PHMSA. I was astonished by the range of things that this department does when I came in. Our Maritime Administration oversees a Merchant Marine Academy that takes its place alongside the military academies and the Coast Guard Academy. We have a piece of commercial space travel, which has become an increasingly important activity for the FAA. So we even operate in a binational partnership with Canada, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was inaugurated by President Eisenhower and Queen Elizabeth, and to this day is a vital part of our supply chains. So that gives you some sense of the different provinces of our department. In terms of trying to make sense of the range of what we do, I realize that it really falls into three categories: building, running, and protecting. Building is the part I talked about in my opening remarks, and we're doing more of it than ever because we have more grant funding at our hands than ever. Taking funds, although we don't run any of the projects, right? We don't directly build a single mile of road. We fund state agencies, we fund transit authorities, we fund airports to do their good work. There's building, and in many ways it's a very fun and rewarding part because we're building the future of the country. Then there's running. Now, I say that advisedly because we actually don't run most parts of the transportation system. We don't run any railroads, we regulate them. We don't run highways, we fund them. But we do own and operate the air traffic system, which is one of the most complex and important civilian operations in the federal government. 24 by 7 by 365. This helps to explain why the FAA is bigger than the rest of our department combined, because the FAA is not only the safety regulator of our aviation system, but also the service provider when it comes to air traffic control. And then the third part, protect, and that's really our regulatory function and our rulemaking. And we're responsible for protecting everybody from a flight attendant covered by the regulations we have on crew rest, to a homeowner in the path of a proposed highway expansion, which will be overseen in terms of our civil rights authorities, to a community like East Palestine, to anybody else who interacts with any of our transportation systems. We manage the standards for vehicles, make sure that vehicles are safer. And so that's how I think about it. Build, run, protect.
That's great. That's great. I wanted to ask you, since you talked about aviation, about with the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia, our ability to fly over Russian airspace has been constrained, shall we say the least. But other countries continue to do so. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how that's impacted both our commercial and our cargo aviation industries, and what you all are doing to try to mitigate those effects.
So U.S. carriers do not fly over Russian airspace, of course. Some other countries have taken the same approach. Some have not. This presents competitive challenges for U.S. passenger and especially for U.S. cargo air carriers, who, in respecting that, of course, are taking on more cost, and it's impacting their schedules. They've adjusted to this, and they've been very responsive to the importance of doing this. But I do think that it would be a positive development if more international partners were to join in this, so that it was not regarded as a competitive issue, but simply as the right thing to do.
So before you leave your job, are you going to recreate the U.S. Merchant Marine Fleet?
So, we talked about my father. On the other side of my family, my grandfather was in the Merchant Marine, and it's a crucially important but strangely quiet part of our national security framework. We should, as a country, do more to shore up our maritime capabilities. I'm speaking, of course, from the civilian perspective. There's a separate conversation going on among our fellow Navy enthusiasts. But this is why we have a Merchant Marine Academy, and by the way, a number of satellite academies around the country, including in my home of Traverse City, where the Great Lakes Maritime Academy sits. Because that and the Ready Reserve Fleet, the Tanker Security Program, those are all very important things when you need them, and I don't think we always realize how much we need them. We would welcome conversations with Congress about how to grow and develop all of that programming, because it's, I think, been too much taken for granted that America's posture as a maritime power, which has, again, commercial and civil sides as well as military dimensions, is so important to our economic security.
Yeah. So I bet in 1967, when President Johnson was thinking about creating this department, it was about, highways, trains, planes, ships. Now climate is an important part of your agenda.
Absolutely.
And probably more so in your tenure. I think you all were at COP in Abu Dhabi and talking a little bit about your efforts on climate. I was wondering if you could share specifically, both domestically, what you all are doing in terms of thinking about policies that decarbonize and are cleaner, but also what consultations you've had, since it's fundamentally a shared environment that we have with the rest of the world. What conversations you're having with either counterparts or other countries about what to do about this challenge?
Well, in the U.S. economy, the single sector that contributes the most greenhouse gases is transportation. And that's true in many, if not most, other economies as well. And it's certainly true globally that transportation plays a major role. So we've aligned with our Department of Energy on a roadmap for decarbonizing transportation, a blueprint to get us toward that goal of net zero in 2050. And it's inevitably the case that every transportation policy decision is also a decision about climate policy, whether we recognize it or not. So we had better recognize it. And that's what we're doing. Some things that are probably better publicized than others. Obviously, our efforts around electric vehicles are an example of that. We're working hard to make sure that electric vehicles are affordable and that you can charge them when you need to, so that we can decarbonize surface transportation in the U.S. But I would also say, no matter how good we are at going electric, something that's been there all along that is a huge part of our climate solution is good old-fashioned transit. Although I put an asterisk on old-fashioned because we're funding zero-emission buses to be part of the transit systems. But no matter, even if you're in an all-electric ride, everybody who finds that it's a better choice for them to take transit brings with them a huge reduction in carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. Part of this goes down to the very design of our communities, which is the relationship between land use and transportation. Can we design the footprint of our communities to not require people to take as many trips as they do?
How many people were on 66 or 95 this morning?
It really matters, right? Just the logic of our built environment. And these are all very rich discussions for international engagement. So is CORSIA, where the U.S. has played a leading role, and our department has been very active in helping to align around standards for.
And CORSIA is.
We
have an acronym, Joe.
Yeah, now you're going to challenge me to
oh, that's okay. That's okay.
Carbon offsetting.
CORSIA, yes. We all know what CORSIA is.
It has to do with. I know the C and the O are carbon offsetting. I need to relearn the acronym. Yeah. But it's the framework for aviation emissions reduction, which importantly includes commitments around the use of sustainable aviation fuel. And we're also funding a SAF Grand Challenge to try to stimulate that. This is a manifestly international challenge because, of course, we need to come to alignment on what counts as sustainable for sustainable aviation fuel purposes. And it's much more fungible if we have a book and claim system than if everybody's got to have their own captive system for getting that sustainable aviation fuel into their aircraft. So all of these things require engagement in many multilateral fora, whether it's ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, whether it's the COP talks where our department was present at Abu Dhabi, as you mentioned, and I was at the Glasgow talks. Or in the G7, where this, along with supply chains, has been very high on the list of topics that we took up in Japan at our ministerial last year. We're all in this together. It's the same air, it's the same climate, and the consequences. So not only is transportation contributing a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions, but transportation is often the first to feel the impact when there's a problem. I mentioned I was just in the Pacific Northwest. About a year and a half ago, they experienced heat waves that should not even statistically be possible. And they had such impact that the transit agency had to shut down because their cables were in danger of melting. We've seen runways buckle because they were not built to the specifications that would expect them to withstand the kind of climate impacts they've seen. And I, as in many things, approach this as a former mayor because we experienced what I was told was a 1,000-year flood when I was mayor. I heard the rain coming overnight. An hour later, heard the rain still coming, and then 2 hours later was activating our emergency operations center to deal with that 1,000-year flood. Our next 1,000-year flood came about a year and a half later. And so we need to get out of the business of telling communities and cities to put back a road exactly the way it was when it got washed out by a 1,000-year flood that is about to become an annual event. And that's part of what we're trying to update in terms of the resilient strategies that we have. And we're putting our money where our mouth is. Funding more resilient infrastructure that can withstand these climate impacts. Because no matter, even if we pass the tests in front of us with flying colors, which the reality, of course, is much more complex than that on mitigating and preventing, we already have to be adapting.
So are the grants through the Infrastructure Act, are they moving out and you're seeing progress in terms of dealing with some of these issues?
Yeah, whether it's one of the less glamorous dimensions of the airport terminal grants I mentioned, it's not the gleaming new concourse, but the central utility plants of some of our airports. Solar features, we're funding that's going to help them operate the airport more efficiently, but also with fewer emissions. So there's an economic and an environmental benefit. We're funding the deployment of electric vehicle chargers around the country to help deal with this issue of range anxiety that is one of the two big barriers to EV adoption. We're investing in port infrastructure that is greener than what we have inherited. And again, every investment we make in transit is of itself potentially an investment in climate too. So it's a big theme in what we're doing with our funding and our investments, whether the program has climate in its name or not.
So before we turn it over to the audience, I wanted to ask, Meridian has seen sort of a transformation in diplomacy over the last couple of decades, where our wonderful embassies and ambassadors continue to do great work, but governors and mayors are increasingly engaged internationally. In some cases, you were a mayor, but you also work with governors, and that seems to be a good thing because, one is there are economic benefits to this for both parties, but also there's continuity in our foreign relations where we can have multiple relationships, multiple layers of diplomacy. And I was wondering if you might comment, I know this isn't a transportation question, about the importance of these connections between subnational leaders around the world.
Yeah, I'm enthusiastic about subnational engagement, and I hope that there's even more investment in this going forward. I benefited from it as a mayor. I was in an ACYPL, and don't ask me what that stands for either, but I was in that programming that gave us a chance to visit Myanmar with somebody from each level of government to discuss different patterns for budgeting. Participated in a visit to Argentina through a multi-partisan, in Argentine terms, programming that was developed and overseen by the Jesuits there, who had a relationship with the University of Notre Dame in South Bend. So as a mayor, I saw the power of these relationships. But I would also say that they're very powerful for tackling some of the very challenges we're talking about. We talk about roadway safety. Roads and streets are a very local concern, but the international best practices need to be shared across international boundaries. Climate. I mean, when I was 10 or 15 years ago, first becoming involved in what is now the climate mayors. This started because a group of a few dozen mayors who got to know each other around the world realized that collectively, just those few dozen cities that they led represented the bulk of the world's GDP. And they were impatient waiting for their capitals to catch up on climate policy and start doing work on their own because they realized so much of that depended on local decisions anyway. So I believe the problem-solving power of engagement among mayors, among state leaders and their equivalents is especially timely right now, given what we have in front of us. And if there's anything we can do as a department that works so often with and through city and state and tribal leaders, we would welcome opportunities to help foster that.
It's interesting, Secretary Blinken hosted mayors from the hemisphere in Denver. We were part of this conference of mayors, and when the mayors got together, they immediately started talking about specific challenges and left politics. The major foreign policy differences between their countries were kind of left on the table, and they got down to brass tacks. And
exactly.
And it was,
in the same way,
really good to see.
When you're at a U.S. conference of mayors, you got a room. It's probably the last room in America full of high-profile elected officials from different parties who like each other.
Right.
At that scale, I mean, you would become friends with mayors without even knowing what party they were from. It didn't come up. A lot of us were definitely Democrats or definitely Republicans, but we formed relationships across that because the problems are so common. And if that can be done in a polarized America, then certainly the opportunity to get around international obstacles by connecting around shared challenges. Mayors love talking to other mayors about mayor stuff. Because by definition, you're the only one in your city.
Do you all call it geeking out?
Absolutely.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
So I'd like to go to the audience, and before I do, I wanted to say that the Department of Transportation has an Assistant Secretary for International Affairs and an office there. And if we don't get to your question, or if you need to want to work with the department or ask a question, Meridian would be happy to facilitate that connection. So
great.
There she is. Meridian. Yep.
Secretary, thank you so much for your time today. Mariam Mujica, I work for Booking Holdings. We met with my CEO a few months ago. We're in the travel and hospitality space, so Priceline, Kayak, Booking.com. I'd love to hear how AI has been around for a while, but how generative AI is coming into the everyday work and the 3 pillars you spoke about, and where you see the biggest potential or impact that it will have on all the things that the department oversees.
Thank you. Timely question in a profound area of attention, and one that I think has many dimensions of potential for us. To take some of the non-obvious ones, you look at the number of uncrewed aircraft, drones that are going into our airspace. There are not enough human beings in the world to train to be air traffic controllers, to handle all of that in the way that we handle regular crewed aircraft. So it's one example of a technical challenge where we think AI could have a lot of potential to help. Maybe a less intuitive example is, before we even get into things that are in vehicles, I'm always thinking about how technology can work outside of vehicles, because the most important technology development in transportation of the last decade turned out to be the smartphone, which I don't think any of us were expecting, with all the things that were happening with aircraft and spacecraft. But the one that really changed transportation, how you navigate, how you board an aircraft, all of it was the smartphone. So there are some non-intuitive connections here. I actually think artificial intelligence and generative AI, in its not too distant state, could play an important role in project delivery by helping with paperwork. A huge part of what gets in the way of timely delivery of projects is the complexity of the administrative processes that are involved with approving and permitting it. And while those protections are there for very good reasons, often they are duplicative, they are arcane, and they are very effort intensive, especially for low income and small communities that are among the ones we should most be racing to serve better with transportation grants, but who have trouble navigating the process for transportation grants because they're so complicated. So I would love to take some of these bots and turn them loose on permitting processes that it's unglamorous, but I think very important. Then there is, I think, a more familiar, obvious, and very important use case, which is around driving. So there, again, we're at a crisis level in terms of deaths on our roadways right now. Literally proportionate to gun violence in the United States, but getting radically less attention. I think precisely because we're so used to it. We just grew up bathed in this. All of us know people who've been killed in car crashes. So, as if we had grown up during a war, we just are accustomed to it. But it doesn't have to be that way. So I am, in the long run, very optimistic about the potential of automated technologies to save lives. Even if they are not perfect, they have a major advantage over the track record of human drivers, which has been bordering on the murderous in the United States. But that's the long run. The problem is, how do we get from here to there?
Right.
And right now, maybe you've seen some of these viral images going around, for example, of the guy, I don't know if this was staged or not, but there's one of a guy with his goggles, his VR goggles, behind the wheel of a car doing, I don't know if he's checking his email, I don't know what he's doing in there, but he's not driving. And so I'll use this as the forum for my daily reminder that there is no technology you can buy today in a car, no matter what it's called, where you don't have to have your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road. I don't care what it's called.
That's a key takeaway from
Pay
today.
attention when you're driving, right?
Right.
So much so that when I was at the Detroit Auto Show with the president, we were looking at some of the remarkable technologies that are coming along with level 2 automation, which is somewhere between cruise control as we know it today and true automation, which you can get. You know, it's the thing that nudges you back into your lane or knows how far you are from the car in front of you. These are safety features. But some of the newest features are to protect you from yourself being too reliant on those safety features. Like if you get that little picture of the coffee cup that shows up on the dashboard telling you, hey, pay attention again. So we now have to have technology to protect you from depending on the technology. So we have a very messy few years ahead of us, which we need to navigate wisely, because the pot of gold at the end of this is a chance to save tens of thousands of lives. And that's the AI application that I'm most excited about.
Any of our ambassadors have anything on their minds, or no? Just Friday, kind of taking it all in? Nothing. They are working very, very hard, ladies and gentlemen.
Secretary Paul Myler, DCM at the Australian Embassy. Obviously, you've made an extraordinary commitment to the transition to EVs, including through the IRA. I think we're starting to see a pretty substantial response to it as well, in particular at the moment in the nickel industry, where I think it's incontrovertible to say that China's just crashing the market with the intention of denying the ability to access the IRA subsidies. You cannot get to the required percentages if there's only Chinese nickel and lithium on the market. We're starting to think about that very, very urgently. What's the sort of discussion happening on the administration side about how you actually deliver on the promise of the IRA?
Yeah, thank you. It's very much on our minds, and we work jointly with the Department of Energy on this because you really can't separate the two. And frankly, in my view, the last administration allowed China to build an advantage with regard to EV markets. And we now need to recover and get ahead of that advantage. And I think we are. That's the design of the IRA. But as you say, now that the design is out there, there will be various attempts to undermine it. And it's not just the sourcing, but really the refining and the processing of some of these critical inputs that is at issue, which very much can be friend-shored and on-shored, but with intention. And so we need to make sure that we, and by the way, an added complication with this is that the long-term battery chemistry is not totally stabilized, right? There's still a lot of technological developments that could affect what needs to be sourced, which can be challenging from the perspective of certainty for the markets and from a policy perspective too. So we are working to make sure that we tune as many of the knobs and dials as we have available to us through the toolkit that is in the IRA and our other policies. But just hearing you raise this is a great example of why we need to be in strong international dialogue as we do it, because you will see some of these dynamics. You will have lived through some of these dynamics in ways that the U.S. was not as susceptible to in the past, and we need to make sure that our antenna are engaged to pick that up. Thank you for raising that.
Good point you made. The Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State have to work together, every day very closely, and you probably have to work with the Secretary of Energy in close,
Yeah, we've never done something like this. We set up an entire joint office, about $300 million going into a joint effort, because of course it's so difficult to even separate. They have so much expertise on battery technology, on alternative fuel. We have the expertise on highways. So if you're building an alternative fuel corridor, it's got to be done jointly, right? And of course, Secretary Granholm's leadership has been fantastic in this, and I like to think it partly has to do with her shared heritage in the American Midwest, having been governor of Michigan, that she's attuned to what this means for our auto industry as well.
And I should give a shout out to, to Terry Ferriello, our trustee with United, thank you. But one of our chairs recently, most recently, is Governor Jim Blanchard of Michigan, who was part of the whole auto, I can't remember what years those were, but the original automotive, I don't want to call it bailout, but whatever you want to, whatever you want to call it. Questions? Ambassador, good to see you.
Mr. Secretary, good morning. I'm Kevin Whitaker. I was ambassador to Colombia from 14 to 19. When I was in Colombia, the Colombians had a multi-billion-dollar effort to rebuild their road network, and were very interested in having American firms involved. And I simply couldn't get any American firms to show any interest in this multi-billion-dollar effort. And what happened at the end of that, of course, was Chinese moved in. They're doing it now with a metro project in Bogota. So in both cases, we had an opportunity there, yet it couldn't execute on it. I wonder what incentives might exist to get U.S. firms involved in these things, and perhaps by getting state and local governments involved as well, because they're the ones who are executing these kinds of projects at this scale, which is different from the Halliburtons and whatnot that operate at a bigger scale.
Yeah, I think the answer may well be embedded in your question, which is that many of these firms are used to serving state and local governments that are ultimately the customer. And there's a lot of market distortions and failures in that too that concern me, because the states and local governments are under such pressure to deliver that sometimes efficient solutions get overlooked. For example, I think there are many mayors who are under such pressure to address the backlog of roads that need to be improved in their cities, that if somebody offered them a physical mixture and a material solution that would be 50% more durable at a 20% price premium, they might feel compelled to say no, because it meant that they would be paving fewer lane miles of road that year. And so we should work to straighten out some of these dynamics, partly through the incentives that arise in those markets. And we have maybe a less well-known part of our department I'm very proud of, called the Build America Bureau, which is all about better financing approaches. And can smooth out the financing in order to help with everything from transit-oriented development to big P3s for infrastructure delivery. But our market is messy in the US, whether it's road building or anything else in infrastructure. And yet there is so much global opportunity. So I think the best answer I give to your question is that yes, we should be engaging more of the local and state departments that are in the first instance, typically the customer for these firms, which for that reason sometimes develop a very specialized and bespoke way of looking at it that has as much to do with how to navigate that state's processes and people as it does the simple question of how to build a road. And I'm trying to get us a little more in the mentality of just how do you build a road, because we've learned that so many of the inefficiencies that we've seen and the cost and time to deliver have to do with how customized everything is around here. And offline, I'd love to learn more about just your experience in Colombia, because the attention that they paid. I mean, the place that really showed the world bus rapid transit and what it could do, right? The sophistication of what has gone on there in transportation and transit, I think, really should be an example.
The mayor of Bogota, who's a dynamo, was just here and does an amazing job. Again, looking at all these issues. I did want to just give I guess a quick ad for Meridian is looking at this issue of, as you know, Ambassador, of why U.S. companies aren't moving in as aggressively to international markets and investing in the global South. And what we have seen, we've convened the agencies, is, it's about de-risking, one of them. It's about, rule of law and, ensuring that the investments and the shareholders of these companies, that they, these investments will be safe. And also, what tools does the United States have, whether it's XM or USTDA or USDFC, Commerce? Yeah. What does our toolkit look like? Because our competitors have an integrated toolkit where they go effectively into these markets with a combined government and private sector. There's no line between the two, and we need to have a strategy to address this. Sorry for that, but had to share that point. Let's see, we've got to have another question. By the way, I think our staff is fantastic here at Meridian. I think more staff have turned out to see you than any other speaker for some reason.
I'm honored.
So I would love for one of our staff to get the opportunity to ask a question.
I think I saw someone in the way back there, but now I lost my line.
Let's get a non-shy staff person.
There we go.
I'm not staff yet, though I'm here all the time. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for being here and for your comments. My name is Emilia Welbom. I'm from a 3M company, and thank you a lot for your comments about road safety, an important topic that we have to keep our attention on that. When it comes to the IRA, there is funding for bike lanes, and as a happy biker, as you can hear from my accent, I'm from a country that loves biking, and DC has done a great work, but as soon as you leave the city, you end up on a freeway. Yeah. And how do you see the progress in the IRA for bike lanes?
Yeah. So I'm passionate about this. Matter of fact, the first time I spent in the company of a transportation secretary was when my predecessor, Secretary Fox, led a delegation of mayors to visit Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and Oslo to see what the achievements were there in terms of bikeability. But as impressive as all of that was, the image that I most have in my mind from that visit was when they showed us the pictures of what the streets looked like in the 1970s, when those cities were as car-centric as any city in the US. And what that told me was that this was not the result of some innate Nordic, cycle-friendly DNA, but rather a series of policy choices that were made to make sure that it was safer and more efficient. even before it was understood how important climate change would be as yet another layer of why it is worth having good active transportation infrastructure. This has been a very important part of many of our projects in the infrastructure plan, and it's been true whether it's, for example, the large bridge I was just telling you about in the Pacific Northwest. If you go on it now, you do not want to be riding a bike or walking on that bridge. It's physically possible, but not something most people would want to do. We're changing that, and this will have the right kind of dimensions for good bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. As you mentioned, DC has done a great job with this. Matter of fact, the 100th mile of protected bike lane was completed on New Jersey Avenue outside of the US DOT headquarters. I don't know if that was for my benefit or just a coincidence, but they've been doing a great job.
So do you have a road bike or a mountain bike? Or a hybrid?
Road bike. I started out on a commuter bike, and then I finally got a proper road bike. And I love zipping around the trails of this region.
You go all the way out to Mount Vernon.
Yeah, the Mount Vernon Trail, the one that takes you past Dulles on the old Washington and Old Dominion rail line. But this is not just about, I mean, recreation is a good purpose, but this is not just about recreation. These things are not ornamental. They are, in fact, part of the solution to the crisis of roadway death that I was talking about earlier. Yeah. So whenever I go to some place that raises concerns about bike lanes as if it was some expensive frill that we were putting on our roadway designs, I remind them that this is a question of life and death, that if we have good, safe bike lanes, that means that more people will return home when they should, and it also is a relief on congestion. Just intuitively, think about how much space a bike takes up versus how much space a car takes up. So even if you're not riding a bike, you're benefiting when other people are, because there's less congestion on the road. And so this will continue to be a big part, whether we're talking about complete streets in downtown streetscape redevelopments or the longer trail networks that many communities are trying to hook up. We believe that, yes, this is partly cultural, but I believe good investments, good policies, and good tactics are an important part of how the culture then matches the work we're doing. And last but not least, I want to recognize 3M as one of the first partners in our National Roadway Safety Strategy, which takes private as well as local nonprofit partners, and we're always eager to sign up more. So thanks for being part of the solution there.
Well, we've got time. I'm going to go to our terrific Executive Vice President, Natalie Jones, to represent the staff with her question.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to go in the opposite direction, from bicycles to space. You mentioned that one of the areas that transportation is looking at is space commercialization and travel. Can you talk a little bit about the state of the industry now and where you see it going in the next 5 or 10 years, and the role of international collaboration in making sure that these are opportunities that are extended to everyone around the world?
Yeah, the potential is enormous, and so is the growth of this sector. The statistics are incredible. The pace at which we are licensing commercial space launches out of the FAA went from once every few weeks or every month to I'm looking because seated next to you is Matt Lehner, who has left the FAA, but he used to be the person responsible for reminding me of the statistic. So I wonder if you still have it. It's
about once a week, beginning of demonstration, twice a week. In the middle of that, we're almost 4.
Yeah.
Commercial, yeah. 4 a week.
It's something like from once a month to once a week and growing, right? And that's only going to continue. We have to put it diplomatically, we have inherited a complex jurisdictional reality when it comes to how this is overseen. The responsibilities as divided between NASA, Commerce, and the Department of Transportation are something that we still need to refine, I think, and make sure they're ready for the future. And we are in the Space Council led by Vice President Harris. But the bottom line is the more of it there is, the more we're going to have to address it. And by the way, this isn't just about space tourism. I think when people hear commercial space, they're thinking about billionaires going up in their rockets. That's part of it, but mostly
what is it about billionaires and going to space? They just love it.
Well, if I could, I would, right? I think we all just.
I'm going to wait till they work a few kinks out.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, that's the other bit, right? I mean, right now, I think the state of regulation on some of these things has more in common with the early internet than it does the present standard of of passenger aviation, where if there is so much as a loose bolt, that could lead to moving heaven and earth to deal with that, so that we're 1,000% safe, right? I think the attitude on commercial space launches, especially in their experimental stage, has been more that, if your experimental rocket blows up on the ground, we need to make sure nothing on the ground is damaged outside of your project. And on the way up, we need to make sure you don't hit anything as you go through the national airspace. But we need to develop a much more fulsome framework that is looking after the safety concerns, certainly the concerns of orbital space debris, which are a classic tragedy of the commons that can only be addressed through not just good domestic regulation, but good international cooperation.
And we got to keep the Russian Death Star from going up.
Yeah,
right?
whatever that is,
whatever it is,
it's not helping.
We don't need it. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us at Meridian. Thank you for your leadership, and we know that you have many things on your plate, and if there's anything we can do to support you in your efforts, we will do so.
Thank you very much.